On today's show, we're delving into the game of Charlie Trethewey, a big mobile right shot defenseman from the U.S. National Team Development Program who's an August birthday and has a bunch of developmental runway.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm your host, Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects. And on today's show, we're sticking with a player in my region that I've been watching all season long here, and that's Charlie Trethewey, a pretty divisive prospect for a variety of reasons. But the tools, as we'll be exploring in the first segment, are a big area of strength. In the second segment, we're going to look at some of the bigger question marks in his game, looking at the habits and the intelligence, the hockey IQ. And finally, in the third segment, we're going to wrap up the show by looking ahead at the projections, where he might be going on draft day, what his range is, which teams would be good fits, and which NHL players he has a similar stylistic play to. So that's the outlook here for today's show. But before we delve into everything, today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. Turn any TV into your Xbox. No console needed. Head to amazon.com/firetv locked on to learn more. So let's just dive straight into the show here and talk about Charlie Trethewey, a very interesting player that I have liked a little bit more in this year's draft class, and I know a lot of other scouts over at Elite Prospects have. I've been quite a big fan of the overall runway, and it has to be noted that with this prospect, in terms of seeing him in the NHL, it is entirely a projection. There's been a lot of inconsistencies this season and a lot of reasons to have questions, but the tools are fantastic, and he's off to a very, very strong development program where defensemen like him, who need time and space to really work things out and iron out kinks, it's a great landing spot because these players often make really big strides in their developments at the college level. So going to Boston University, just like the player that we just talked about in the last episode, Jack Murtagh, I think is a really good fit for the player. And he's an August 2nd, 07 birthday. So very young for the draft class, just a month and a half off the cutoff for being eligible for next year's draft in 2026. And as a 6'2", 196-pound right shot defenseman, this is a player with a really big frame on him as a young guy who's still just going to be adding weight and maybe even growing an inch or two over the coming years. So a player that plays physically, has a pretty heavy release, and overall leverages that weight that he has, even at this young of an age, to his advantage. This season, in all competitions, he's played in 54 games for the program, where he's logged 6 goals, 13 assists, 19 points, and 33 penalty minutes this season. Against USHL competition specifically, that has been 2 goals and 9 points in 24 games. So the offense does not jump off the page, but he's been mainly playing around the 15-minute mark this season, and there's been stretches where he's playing closer to 18 and stretches where he's been playing closer to 10 or even 12, especially in the middle portion of the season. He was relatively inconsistent, and even with the missing Carter Amako, who of course went down with injury back in November, Trethewey took some time to be able to establish himself as the clear replacement in that role, as a stabilizing force on the right side on a potential top pairing for the NTDP. And often you saw other players like Asher Barnett or Drew Schock or even Donato Bracco kind of switching over to the right-hand side and playing that role instead, with Trethewey falling further down the lineup. But as the seasons progressed, he's become a lot more stable and played the simple plays rather than searching for the perfect plays, and in doing so, become a much more reliable defender here for the NTDP. But the overall question in his projection remains: is he going to be able to mitigate risk while still making good plays? And that's kind of the balance with Trethewey, where when he's trying to find the really good plays, he's often making mistakes and trying to do so, hang on to pucks for far too long. And when he's trying to just play a simple game, he's often missing the best plays in front of him. So he's at his best when he's able to kind of straddle those two sides of his game, which I have caught in a number of viewings this season where he's been doing very well in kind of combining those aspects, but it has not been consistent by any means. And I know a lot of the other scouts at Elite Prospects, whether it be Cam Robinson or Mitch Brown or Daniel G, have seen a lot of those haphazard viewings with Trethewey. And when he's not on his game, he can be pretty rough to watch from an analytical standpoint. The shot is pretty hard. It's a very heavy release from the point. I think it's an above average projection, especially among blue liners, but it's not something that I think is going to be a core piece of the game he plays at the next level. He's not going to be like a rare defenseman power play trigger man, and I don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to score you loads of goals either. But I think he's a player that's going to be able to learn to create through his shot and learn to use his shot as a playmaking ability as well, in order to kind of vie for those like sticks for tips on the way to the net, traffic going in front of it, timing those shots as well with a bit more, I guess, cerebral nature than just blindly swinging pucks towards the net, like has been the case at times this season. But overall, I think the shot is pretty solid. The passing ability is average. It's above average at its best and well below average at its worst. So even though he's getting an average grade, it's because it's kind of just like the mean is in the middle rather than him consistently being at that middle spot. There's not that much consistency in it. If you want the consistency of the passing, it's probably more of a 3 grade. It's significantly below par. But when he's on his game with the passing ability, there can be a real level of deception. He has hit some really impressive curls and hooks around opponents and accessing passing lanes that just aren't really being expected at all, especially for a defenseman who has largely been playing more of a stay-at-home role, at least later on in this campaign, to be able to hit. And he's been able to do that at times. But when he's not on his game, when things aren't flowing, when it just isn't clicking just as it should for this player, then you're seeing errant passes and going all the way out down for icings, missing very simple 5 or 6 foot passes as well, and things can really fall apart in the passing game. So this grade kind of straddles that as well, of the dichotomy in Charlie Trethewey's game, where you have some flashes of brilliance, you have some inconsistency, you have some real difficult mistakes, and then you also have some games where he's just playing bang average hockey right down the middle. It's kind of anywhere along that span is what you can expect when you're going into a viewing for this player. But in my opinion, yes, there is a concern with that style of inconsistency and erraticism in a player's game. But he's so young and he has such good tools, like we're going to talk about here in a sec. I'm not over. I would take this swing personally, even in the later ends of the first round or in the early second round. I think there's a lot to kind of swing on with this player. The skating is fantastic. He's a very fluid skater on his feet. I'd give it a 6.5 grade. Explosiveness from a standstill, being able to make up a lot of ground in just a couple strides, or just the agility, the lateral mobility, the four-way adaptability. These are all things that are significantly above average in my view, and it's the thing that makes the rest of his game tick. And the mobility is a thing I think is going to be a real stabilizing feature in his game as well when he progresses through the ranks of the NCAA and the AHL and eventually the National Hockey League. The mobility is something he's going to be consistently able to rely on as something that is above the average of his competition at all of those levels. I think he's already a plus level skater. Even if you're talking about NHL competition, it's a really strong aspect of his game. The physicality, I think, is also along those lines, maybe a little bit weaker. A 6th grade is what I'd give it, but he's a very strong player who can crush players into the boards. He uses physicality to separate opponent from puck, and he's become a lot more practical with his physical involvements here as the season has gone on. Rather than trying to go for a big hit or go for something flashy, he's just leaning into his opponents, leaning into them, trying to get the puck off of them in that sense. And overall, a guy that's able to use his body in a variety of ways. He's an active stick defensively, but is not afraid of layering body afterwards if stick checks are not working to turn the puck over. And a player I think has a lot of potential as a physical guy on the blue line, especially when you layer that with that mobility, as we'll touch on in the next segment. But that wraps things up here for the first one. In the next one, we'll talk about the IQ and the toolkit, how everything combines in his game. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. The Stanley Cup playoffs are here. And if you've never been to a live NHL playoff game, it's unlike anything else. The intensity, the speed, the energy in the building, it's next level. And thanks to Game Time, getting in the door is easier and more affordable than ever before. Game Time is the fastest way to grab playoff tickets, even for those must-see matchups. Prices actually drop as puck drop gets closer, and with last-minute deals, you can save up to 60%. Their all-in pricing shows the total cost up front, so there's never any surprise fees at checkout, and the app even shows you panoramic seat views so that you know exactly what you're getting before you buy. And with Game Time ticket coverage, I know that I'm protected, whether it's cancellation protection, job loss assurance, or their 24-hour return guarantee. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKDOWNNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's keep the episode rolling here, talking about Charlie Trethewey of the U.S. National Team Development Program. And let's delve in a little bit more into the details of the habits and the intelligence with this player. The word I keep going back to here is going to be progression. It's not perfect. Things are still quite raw. Things are still very much in development with Trethewey, but they've gotten so much better by magnitudes since the beginning of the campaign. Early in the season, with the puck on a stick, it was a true game of hot potato. True lack of composure, always a chaotic in possession, passes going all the way everywhere, very, very errant, constantly in the breakout, looking for the perfect Hail Mary stretch pass and regularly icing the puck or turning it over, getting it picked off by an opponent in the defensive zone before it even crossed the defensive blue line. These are things that just really marred his game earlier on in the season that made watching him genuinely quite difficult to watch at times. He was not a fun player to scout earlier on in the season for me, but as the years gone on, there's been more and more things that get me excited as not just a scout, but a hockey fan as well. The combination of physicality and mobility and being able to kill plays along the boards off the rush, it's one of the better ones among players in my region this season in the USHL. And overall, I think that the level of composure that he's gained in his on-puck, but also off-puck games, defensively and offensively, has just been so promising. I think that this is a player that's never going to be like the image of composure at the NHL level, but he's a player that's become quite stable and consistent here late in the campaign for the NTDP. And again, there's still some games even later on the season that are less consistent and less effective. But the average Trethewey in the last 3 months of the season has been a player that keeps things much more simple. He's, rather than searching for the perfect play in transition, he's going for the simple, good option that's in front of him and keeping the puck moving, not holding on to possession for very long, keeping his puck touches significantly shorter, and just not being dispossessed nearly as often as a result of that. Not only in terms of being pickpocketed himself when he's carrying the puck, but also in terms of making quick decisions. That way he's not being forced into making poor decisions when he hangs onto the puck and gets like massive forechecking pressure after 3, 4, or 5 seconds of hanging onto possession. These are things that have really come quite some ways with this player, and that's a trajectory that makes me quite excited in terms of seeing where that might lead him in the next 2, 3, or 4 seasons. Blending physicality and mobility again is something that just is so effective in terms of killing the rush. But this gap control is also something that's been quite interesting for me to keep track of this season, because in certain games it's a bit lackluster and a bit inconsistent. But as a whole, I think that this is a player that's been quite effective in keeping quite suffocating gaps, not giving his opponents all that much space to work with, and just being a guy that keeps his stick and body very active, keeps his feet moving, and is constantly a threat of closing his gaps very aggressively. And these are things that I think are also very projectable for the modern game in the NHL. as a defender, but something that he's going to have to work on is just that composure under pressure on retrieval specifically. When he's going to retrieve pucks behind his own net and there is a guy on his back, more often than not, a poor decision or an unprecise pass is made from that situation. And still, quite often, those are ended up kind of corralled by his teammates and possession isn't lost. But these just aren't clean plays that he's able to execute when pressured on retrievals. So that's definitely something to work on. And in terms of the habits, I think that shoulder checking more regularly, being more aware of his surroundings, where he's being pressured and where his outlet options are before he even gets the puck on his stick on the retrieval is going to make a world of a difference. But still, there are reasons to question the overall projectability with this player. There are some kinks in his game, and I know that the doubts for his projection have been more embodied by the scouts around me than in myself. I think that as the year has progressed, I've seen a player that I'd be quite comfortable taking a swing on in like the 28 to 32 range, even in the late first round, because he has true second pairing potential with how he moves and how the physicality complements, and also the runway in his offensive game, because the mobility can open up a lot of offensive opportunities for him. And in his AAA days, this was a truly dynamic offensive defenseman going end to end every single game. And there is still that skill deep down in this player, just hasn't been coming out in good ways this season. When it's been coming out, it's often been in terms of trying to make the perfect play, often leading to mistakes as well. But I'd love to see him try to dip his toes back into that style rather than jumping headfirst back into it, because the composure and the solidity and the stability in his game here that he's added late in the season is really important in terms of seeing him as a true NHL talent in the future. But adding in some more of this upside is what really would make his second pairing potential concrete in my eyes. But still, he's a player that I think has significant potential, even if he doesn't add that offense into his game. If he's just a defense first guy who's able to really overhaul his composure on retrievals and become a breakout specialist, and there's a very clear role or a very clear path to a number 4 defenseman role, even without that massive explosion offensively in his game. But that wraps things up here for the second segment. In the last one, we're going to look ahead at what this player projects as in the NHL, where he might go on draft day, which we've already been talking about a little bit here, and which NHL players play like him. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Right now, when you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. I love how FanDuel makes betting so easy. Whether it's picking my favorite team or delving into player props, from three-pointers to steals and assists, FanDuel has so many ways of betting on your favorite team and taking the swings that you have an inkling about before the game even tips off. Plus, after the game does tip off, you can even combine your live prop bets into a same game parlay for a chance to win big. Don't miss out. Head to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. All right, let's wrap things up here in the final segment, talking about Charlie Trethewey, whose full name is Charlton Trethewey. Very, very fun little name there for the big defenseman from the NTDP. But let's talk about his draft range here on draft day in late June. I think he's going to end up falling between 35th overall and 50th overall. So a second round talent of where he's going to go on draft day. But as a mobile right shot defenseman, he may very well go on day one as well, even though there are these areas of question marks. And I have an inkling, I have a feeling that there might just be one team, and I don't know which team that is, that likes him significantly more and would take that swing in the early 20s, because the way he approaches the game, the way he has so much runway in his development, in his progression, how much he's shown as well this season of being able to calm things down and make simple plays and not trying to do everything with every single puck touch. I think that this is a guy that could see some fanfare in the first round. But if I'm a betting man, if I'm playing the odds, I'm going for the 35 to 50 range here on the at the draft. And there's a number of teams that fall in that range where I think he'd be a really interesting fit for what the team needs. First, we have the Montreal Canadiens, just eliminated from the Stanley Cup playoffs by the Washington Capitals in 5 games. And the Habs need right shot defensemen in their system. Like right now, their only two like significant prospects down the right-hand side on the blue line are Logan Mailloux and, of course, David Reinbacher, who is the blue chip one among those. But I think adding a player in like Charlie Trethewey, who would not have any pressure of needing to become like the number one defenseman or first pairing guy in Montreal down the stretch, would be in a good position to kind of just work out his game and solve the and iron out those kinks around everything while also absorbing from players around him. And I think that a guy like David Reinbacher would be a great player to kind of model some aspects in his game after, because you have that's a similar combination of mobility and physicality with those two guys. It's higher end with Reinbacher, but it's not too far off here with Trethewey either. So a lot to like here with the player. I think he'd be a really good fit with the Habs, but there are two other teams I think would also be pretty interesting fits. The New York Islanders, who still, we don't know what the Noah Dobson situation is going to be like, but they could use some reinforcements down the right-hand side nonetheless. And I think Trethewey is very much up their alley. He's not perhaps the most violent guy, which they might usually want to go for as well on the defensive side, but what he does bring is a level of mobility and fluidity in his motions and defensive solidity and flashes here later in the season that I think can make him quite interesting there for the Isles. But the last team that stands out to me as a potential landing spot for Charlie Trethewey in that range of the draft in the second round is the Seattle Kraken, who have yet to spend a single first-round draft selection on a defenseman, and that is probably not going to change here this year. But if they decide to not go for a guy like Radim Murtka or Logan Hensler or one of those other right-shot defensemen available in the first round, I think that compensating and going for Trethewey in the second makes a bunch of sense. This is a team that has already shown their desire to go for flawed but toolsy defensemen in this range of the draft. They picked Lukas Dragicevic as well as Caden Price in the same draft year there just 2 years ago. And those are two players who were very unrefined, but very toolsy, and had a lot of runway in their development. And I think Trethewey has a similar, I guess, aspect in that, but he brings the right shot just like Dragicevic, but he brings a level of physicality that neither Price nor Dragicevic had in their draft year campaigns. And I think he's a guy that would fit in quite nicely with what they're trying to build there in Seattle and the style of players that they're bringing into the fold through the draft. But let's look at his overall ceiling and floor. The upside with Trethewey is quite interesting because he has a level of physicality and mobility, and there's a growing defensive intelligence and composure. I think a second pairing role is certainly still within the possible outcomes, especially if that offense is still able to take a step, as well as the retrieval game, as I was talking about earlier. But the floor is definitely lower than other players in this range of the draft. I think we're talking like an AHL defenseman, probably a top pairing guy who's just very toolsy, but we're taking that one step to the NHL just proves to be too much, where he's just routinely exploited by very agile wingers and overall struggles at that big step in pace between the AHL and the National Hockey League. He might be a guy that just ends up as a tweener in that sense, but I think the likelihood of that happening is relatively low compared to the chances of him becoming an NHLer. The most likely outcome, I think, is probably a number 5 defenseman who's mobile, can bring a level of physicality, can be a bit versatile on the PK and the power play, but needs about 4 or 5 years to grow into an NHL role. He's going to need some time to develop. He's not going to be ready here out of the gate or in a year or even 2. He's going to need time for sure at the college level. But which that'll have similarities to Charlie Trethewey and how he plays the game of hockey? There's 3 names that I underline, and I think I'm going to start with Rasmus Ristolainen. Very similar for a variety of reasons here. Just that Ristolainen has maybe only ironed out the kinks in his decision-making defensively while playing sheltered, like bottom 4 kind of minutes in Philadelphia in the last year or 2. Up until then, he's a very chaotic player where he's always had the mobility, the activation skill, the power in his game, where you see the tools and you see a play that could be a top pairing guy and gets played like a top pairing guy in terms of minutes in the NHL, whether it be with the Buffalo Sabres or then the earlier days of his Philadelphia Flyers career. But it just isn't cut out for that level of competition. The composure is lacking. The precision on passes just isn't there. Possessions routinely lost. And he just gets caved in at even strength. I think that's possible, Trethewey, right? I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the scouts around me have a lot of questions with this guy, because there are just some heebie-jeebies with Rasmus Ristolainen's style habits in his game. But Trethewey is 17 years old. He has time to iron these things out. I think he will do quite a lot of that in the coming seasons. And I think that maybe a player like John Marino is more closer to where he ends up in his NHL career, where you see a player who's been quite chaotic in his junior career here, but finds a way to be a bit more solid, a bit more consistent, a bit more defensively focused, and ends up being more of a specialist in that capacity in the NHL. I think that's possible as well. And if we're thinking overall ceiling, what he could reach at his peak, I think that a player like Filip Hronek would come to mind. Another big, mobile, physical right-shot defenseman who brings a lot of variety in terms of a hard shot, hard play defensively, good rush defending, and can just be an overall good complement for a super mobile and dynamic offensive defenseman. Because Trethewey was prior in his career a very constantly activating offensive defenseman, he has a decent read and sense for his pairing mates activating and where to find them with passes. I found his passing precision and anticipation to be a lot stronger in the offensive zone with his defensive pairing mate activating than, for instance, in transition of connecting passes out of the D zone. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. I think that he could fit in nicely in that kind of role if he really, really hits his ceiling. And not to say that he's going to be like a top pairing guy, but who knows? If he lands in Montreal and plays with Lane Hudson, I think that's possible. But a lot would have to go right. And again, quite a few years are going to have to pass for him to get to that stage. But that wraps things up here for us today. Thank you so much for tuning in as always. If you're watching on YouTube, please let me know down below what you thought about the episode, what your thoughts are on this player, Charlie Trethewey. If you have watched him, are you a big skeptic like others around me are, or do you see the real upside and the potential like I do with this player? And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please do make sure to make us your first listen of the day. We always appreciate our everydayers here on the podcast. And for your second listen of the day, you can head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel break down everything you could possibly want to know to build yourself a competitive and sustainable fantasy roster. But thank you so much for listening. As always, I'm your host, Sebastian High, and I look forward to catching you tuning in again very, very soon.